Let's get to it. Number 10. The Bronze Trumpets of Tutankhamun, the Cairo Museum. The year is 1939. The world is holding its breath. The fragile peace in Europe is shattering, and the drums of war are beginning to beat in Berlin. But in Cairo, Egypt, the focus is not on the future, but on the distant past. The British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, has arrived at the Cairo Museum with a singular, ambitious goal: to broadcast the sound of ancient history to the modern world. They have removed 2 trumpets from the tomb of King Tutankhamun, 1 sterling silver, 1 bronze. These instruments haven't been played in over 3,000 years. They were designed to command armies across the sands of the Nile, to signal the charge of chariots and the fall of empires. As the bandsman, James Tappern, lifted the bronze trumpet to his lips, the lights in the museum flickered and died. The entire building was plunged into darkness. It was a warning, a circuit breaker tripping in the face of history waking up. But the show had to go on. Working by the light of candles, Tappern blew into the mouthpiece. The sound that emerged wasn't music. It wasn't a melody. It was a raw, shattering blast, a primitive, aggressive roar that was broadcast to millions of radio listeners across the globe. It was a sound meant to wake the gods of war, and unfortunately it seems the gods were listening. Let's look at the timeline, because this is where the coincidence argument begins to crumble under the weight of the calendar. The broadcast took place in 1939. Within days of that haunting sound hitting the airwaves, the German Wehrmacht invaded Poland, triggering World War II and the deadliest conflict in human history. The trumpets were returned to their case, and silence fell. Fast forward to 1967. A curator at the museum, perhaps skeptical of the legend or simply unaware of the pattern, allowed the trumpets to be played again for a visiting delegation. Almost immediately following this performance, the Six-Day War erupted between Egypt and Israel, reshaping the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East forever. By this point, the pattern was becoming a hushed rumor among Egyptologists, but in 1990 the trumpets were removed again for study and a brief sounding. The result? The Gulf War began shortly after. The final nail in the coffin of skepticism came in 2011. A staff member, working on a documentary about Tutankhamun, blew into the bronze trumpet to capture the audio fidelity. They treated it as a musical instrument, ignoring its original purpose as a military signaling device. 1 week later, the Egyptian revolution began. The government collapsed, the museum itself was looted, and the region was thrown into a decade of instability. Skeptics will tell you that the Middle East and Europe have always been volatile regions. They argue that if you play a trumpet often enough in a war-torn century, eventually it will coincide with a battle. It's the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, drawing the target after the bullet has hit. But that explanation ignores the specificity of the timing. In almost every instance, the conflict began within days or weeks of the note being sounded. It's as if the trumpet isn't predicting the war, it's the starting gun. The curators at the Cairo Museum have now largely banned the playing of the instruments, not because they are fragile, but because they are afraid. It leaves us with a chilling thought. If sound waves never truly disappear, but just dissipate, how long does the command to attack echo in the ether? And while sound travels, our next object travels with a much deadlier cargo. Number 9. The Basano Vase, secret location. In the 15th century, in a small, nameless village in Italy, a local legend was born that would baffle police forces 500 years later. A young bride was given a wedding gift, a heavy, intricately carved silver vase. It was a masterpiece of Renaissance craftsmanship, shimmering in the candlelight. But the wedding night did not end in celebration. The bride was found dead on the floor of her chamber, clutching the vase to her chest, her face twisted in agony. The vase remained in her family, passed down like a heirloom. But it wasn't a gift, it was a parasite. Over the next generation, every single family member who took possession of the silver vessel died unexpectedly. Eventually, the surviving family members, wise enough to recognize a pattern, locked the vase in a box. They included a parchment note, scrawled with a desperate warning: "Beware, this vase brings death." They hid it away, hoping time would bury the curse. But in 1988, excavation work unearthed the box. The finder saw the silver and ignored the note. He threw the parchment in the trash and sold the vase to an auction house. The clock had started ticking again. This is where the story shifts from folklore to a forensic timeline. The vase was purchased by a local pharmacist in Italy. He was a man of science, healthy and middle-aged. 3 months after placing the vase in his home, he died of a sudden, unexplained systemic organ failure. The vase was then sold to a prominent surgeon, a man who saved lives for a living. He didn't believe in curses. He died 2 months later, at the age of 37, from a cardiac arrest, despite having no history of heart disease. Next, it was purchased by an archaeologist who collected Renaissance artifacts. He surely knew the rumors, but he coveted the object's beauty. 3 months later, he died of an aggressive infection that his doctors could not identify. The final owner was a young man who bought the vase at a significantly reduced price, thinking he had scored a bargain. He died within a month. By this point, the local police were involved. But they weren't investigating a murder suspect, they were investigating the object itself. The families of the victims were demanding the vase be destroyed. Museums were contacted, but upon reviewing the provenance and the string of fatalities, every major museum in Italy refused to accept the donation. They didn't want the liability, so where is it now? This isn't like the Hope Diamond, sitting behind glass for tourists to photograph. The Basano Vase has been effectively erased from the map. Reports indicate that the Italian police eventually took possession of the object. They placed it in a heavy lead box, the kind usually reserved for radioactive waste, and buried it in a secret location that has never been disclosed to the public. Science tells us that silver is antimicrobial. It's supposed to be pure. But is it possible for an object to retain a biological pathogen for 500 years? Or are we looking at something that defies biology entirely? We bury nuclear waste because it emits energy that destroys life. We buried this vase for the exact same reason. But while the vase kills you physically, our next object was designed to destroy you legally, and it inspired the greatest fantasy story ever told. Number 8. The Ring of Silvianus, the Vine, England. In the late 1920s, a farmer plowing a field near Silchester, England, turned up a massive, gaudy gold ring. It was Roman, geometric, and strangely oversized, too big for a normal finger, perhaps meant to be worn over a gloved hand. It bore a crude engraving of the goddess Venus and a Latin inscription, Senescienus live well in God. It seemed like a nice sentiment, a blessing, but the farmer didn't know that 80 miles away, at an excavation site in Lydney Park, archaeologists were digging up a temple dedicated to a dark and obscure god named Nodens. Inside that temple, they found a lead defixio, a curse tablet. The tablet was a contract written by a man named Silvianus who had lost a gold ring. He wasn't asking for the police. He was asking for a divine hitman. The tablet connected the ring to the curse, and when those two halves were reunited, they changed literature forever. The curse tablet found in the Temple of Nodens is specific, petty, and terrifying. It reads, "For the god Nodens. Silvianus has lost a ring and has donated 1/2 of its worth to Nodens. Among those who bear the name of Senescienus, to none grant health until he bring back the ring to the Temple of Nodens." Silvianus had been robbed by Senescienus. The ring found by the farmer was the stolen property. The thief Senescienus had tried to counteract the curse by adding the "Live well in God" inscription, a feeble attempt to use Christian imagery to block a pagan curse. But the curse demanded his health. It demanded his suffering. Here is the connection that blows this wide open. In 1929, the archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler was struggling to connect the ring to the tablet. He needed an expert in philology and Anglo-Saxon history. He called a professor from Oxford University. That professor's name? J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien spent months studying the ring of Silvianus and the curse of the god Nodens. Nodens was often depicted as a fisher king or a hunter, associated with healing in dogs, but also with the deep earth. A few years after this consultation, Tolkien sat down and wrote the first line of The Hobbit. He created a mythology about a one ring, stolen from a dark power that destroys the health and mind of the thief, lengthening their life but stretching it thin, like butter scraped over too much bread. The parallels are not coincidence, they are source material. The ring of Silvianus is the real One Ring, but unlike the book, this ring wasn't destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom. It sits today in a display case at the Vine, a National Trust property in England. Skeptics say Tolkien just used it as inspiration, but the curse on the tablet was never lifted. The ring was never returned to the Temple of Nodens. It's in a museum. Technically, the contract is still active. So if you ever visit the Vine and feel the urge to try it on, don't. And speaking of shiny things that destroy your life, our next item is beautiful, blue, and absolutely lethal. Number 7. The Hope Diamond, Smithsonian Institution. If you look at the Hope Diamond under normal light, it is a breathtaking 45.52 carat dark blue diamond. It looks royal. It looks expensive. But if you turn off the lights and blast it with ultraviolet radiation, the diamond does something that terrified the ancients and baffles the superstitious. It glows a violent blood red. This phenomenon is called phosphorescence, but to the French merchants who first traded it, it looked like the stone was burning with the trapped blood of its victims. The legend says the stone was stolen from the eye of a statue of the goddess Sita in India. The priests cursed the thief and anyone who touched it, and looking at the body count, the curse didn't discriminate between kings, commoners, or socialites. It is a stone that seemingly consumes the sanity of its owners. Let's trace the path of destruction. It starts with Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, the merchant who brought the stone to Europe. Legend says he was torn apart by wild dogs in Russia, a violent end that set the baseline for the King of Diamonds. It moved to King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, both of whom were decapitated. The diamond was then stolen during the French Revolution. It resurfaced in London and eventually fell into the hands of the wealthy MacLean family in America. This is where the evidence becomes personal and tragic. Evelyn Walsh MacLean, a socialite who wore the diamond as a charm, scoffed at the curse. "Bad luck objects are lucky for me," she famously said. She was wrong. After acquiring the stone, her first son was killed in a car crash at age 9. Her daughter died of a drug overdose at 25. Her husband, Edward McLean, ran off with another woman, drank himself into insanity, and died in a mental asylum. The family newspaper, the Washington Post, went bankrupt. Evelyn died hooked on morphine, destitute and alone. The diamond had systematically dismantled her entire lineage. Here is where we have to pick a side. This brings us to a major trigger point in the community. The skeptics argue that this is a classic case of confirmation bias and the curse of the 1%. Wealthy families in the 18th and 19th centuries lived high-risk lives. They had access to cars, which were dangerous, drugs, which were unregulated, and politics, which got you beheaded. The diamond was just a witness to the natural chaos of being rich and powerful. However, the believers argue that the stone carries a specific energetic frequency. They point to the red phosphorescence, caused by traces of boron, as proof that the stone interacts with energy fields differently than other matter. They argue that quartz and crystals can store data, like in watches and computers. Why couldn't a diamond store a negative energetic charge? Which side are you on? Is the Hope Diamond a geological battery of misfortune, or just a very expensive scapegoat for bad life choices? Tell me in the comments. I read them all, but while the diamond targets the rich, our next object decided to burn down the homes of the working class. Number 6. The Crying Boy Paintings, South Yorkshire. Imagine you are a firefighter in South Yorkshire, England in 1985. You respond to a call. A row house is engulfed in flames. You kick down the door, fight back the inferno, and eventually drag the hoses inside to dampen the embers. The devastation is total. The sofa is ash. The TV is a melted lump of plastic. The wallpaper is gone, but hanging on the blackened wall, perfectly untouched, is a painting. It's a kitschy, mass-produced portrait of a toddler with tears streaming down his face. The frame is slightly scorched, but the boy's face is pristine. He is staring at you. Now imagine this happens again the next week. And the week after, different houses, different fires, same painting. This wasn't a creepypasta. This was a documented phenomenon that terrified the British fire brigade so deeply that they officially advised people to remove these prints from their homes. The Crying Boy prints were sold by the thousands in British department stores. The legend grew that the artist Giovanni Bergolin had used an orphan as a model, a boy whose parents had died in a fire. The rumor was that the boy was a fire starter, and his grief was trapped in the image. The hysteria reached a fever pitch when the Sun newspaper began publishing stories of families who lost everything but the painting. People started sending the paintings to the newspaper's office to be destroyed. The paper organized a massive bonfire to burn the curses. But let's look at the forbidden science here. Fire investigators eventually analyzed the prints. They found that the paintings were printed on high-density hardboard, which is difficult to ignite compared to curtains or polyester sofas. Furthermore, the prints were coated in a cheap varnish that contained fire-retardant chemicals. When the heat hit the painting, the varnish would carbonize, creating a protective seal over the image. The string burned, the painting fell face down on the floor, which is cooler, and it survived. It seems like a perfect scientific debunk. It was accidental fireproofing. Case closed, right? Not quite. The science explains why the paintings survived the fire. It does not explain why houses containing the paintings were catching fire at a rate that defied statistical probability. The varnish explains the survival. It doesn't explain the ignition. Were these just cheap paintings bought by people with unsafe heaters? Or did the image itself act as a beacon for combustion? The firefighters in Yorkshire didn't care about the chemistry. They just knew that if they saw that boy on the wall, they were going to have a long night. And speaking of objects that create their own storms, this next gem is locked away for a reason. Number 5. The Delhi Purple Sapphire Natural History Museum, London. Deep in the labyrinthine vaults of the Natural History Museum in London, there is a specific cabinet. Inside that cabinet is a box. Inside that box is another box. There are 7 layers of protection surrounding a stone that isn't even particularly valuable, monetarily speaking. It's known as the Delhi Purple Sapphire, though geologically, it's actually a cursed amethyst. It was looted from the Temple of Indra in Kanpur, India, during the bloody Indian Mutiny of 1857. The soldier who stole it, Colonel W. Ferris, brought it home to England. Within months, he went from a wealthy, healthy cavalry officer to a ruined man. He lost his fortune, his health collapsed, and his son inherited the stone only to suffer the exact same fate. But the true horror began when the stone was given to Edward Heron Allen, a polymath, scientist, and friend of Oscar Wilde. Heron Allen was a rational man. He didn't believe in spooky stories, but after possessing the stone for just a short time, he became convinced it was trying to kill him. Heron Allen documented the phenomena. He gave the stone to a friend who was a singer. She lost her voice permanently. He gave it to a friend who asked to see it. That friend committed suicide shortly after. Desperate to rid himself of the influence, Heron Allen walked to Regent's Canal and threw the stone into the deep, muddy water. He believed it was gone forever. 3 months later, a dredger cleaning the canal found the stone. The jeweler who cleaned it recognized the setting and returned it to Heron Allen. It was a boomerang of bad luck. It refused to be lost. Terrified, Heron Allen packed the stone inside 7 boxes, filling the spaces with charms and holy symbols. He deposited it in his bank's vault with a typed letter of instruction. The box was not to be opened until 3 years after his death. The letter, which sits in the museum today, ends with a chilling sentence: "This stone is trebly accursed and is stained with the blood and the dishonor of everyone who has ever owned it." Heron Allen died in 1943. His daughter, abiding by his wish, waited to donate it to the museum. But here is the twist. The museum ignores the curse. They don't believe in magic. They have the stone. However, current curators have reported that when they have to transport the stone for symposiums, they experience sudden, violent illnesses. Some have reported horrific storms breaking out over the museum when the stone is removed from its vault. The sapphire is chemically just silicon dioxide with iron impurities. It should be inert. But the human track record suggests that some objects collect a debt that can never be paid off. And if you think a stone is heavy, try carrying the weight of a coffin lid that sank a ship. Number 4. The Unlucky Mummy. If you walk into the British Museum's Egyptian room, you will find artifact 22542. It is popularly known as the Unlucky Mummy, although it isn't a mummy at all. It is a mummy board, the beautifully painted wooden inner lid of a coffin. It depicts a high-ranking priestess of Amun-Ra. The colors are vibrant, but the face has an expression that many visitors find unsettling. The legend of this object is so pervasive it has infected history books. You may have heard that this mummy was on the Titanic. You may have heard that it caused the ship to hit the iceberg. That is a myth, a fabrication by journalists in the early 1900s. But the truth of artifact 22542 is actually much more disturbing than the Titanic lie, because the victims of this object didn't die in a single spectacular night. They were picked off, one by one. The board was acquired in Egypt by 4 young English travelers in the late 1800s. They drew lots to see who would purchase it. The winner paid a handsome price. Within weeks he walked out into the desert and never returned. The second man was accidentally shot in the arm by his servant, requiring amputation. The third man found himself financially ruined upon returning to England. The fourth man suffered a severe illness that left him invalid. When the object finally reached England, the pattern continued. A photographer who took pictures of the board claimed that the face on the developed plate was not the painted face of the woman, but a human face twisted in horror. He died shortly after. The sheer volume of accidents associated with the room where the board was stored led the museum to move it to the basement for a time. This brings us to our second critical friction point: skeptics. The rationalists argue that this is pure Victorian hysteria. The British Empire was looting Egypt, and they felt guilty about it. They invented mummy curses as a way to externalize that colonial guilt. If you analyze the thousands of artifacts brought back, a few are statistically bound to be owned by people who have bad luck. However, believers and esotericists propose the psychic defense theory. They argue that the Egyptian priesthood understood the mechanics of consciousness in ways we do not. They suggest that high-value tombs were protected not just by physical traps, but by thought forms or energetic programming attached to the objects, literal psychic landmines designed to trigger mental illness and misfortune in desecrators. Is artifact 22542 a weapon of ancient psychological warfare, or just a piece of painted wood that people love to be afraid of? Let the debate begin below. But while this board destroys your mind, our next object just breaks your neck. Number 3. The Busby Stoop Chair. Thirsk Museum. Thomas Busby was not a nice man. Living in North Yorkshire in 1702, he was a thug, a counterfeiter, and a drunkard. He married the daughter of a petty criminal named Daniel Ötzi. Their relationship was volatile, mostly because Busby was possessive. One night, Busby returned home to find his father-in-law sitting in his favorite oak chair. The argument that followed wasn't about the marriage, it was about the chair. Later that night, Busby bludgeoned his father-in-law to death with a hammer. He was caught, tried, and sentenced to hang. On his way to the gallows, he was granted a final drink at his local pub. He stood up, looked at his favorite chair, and cursed it. "May sudden death come to anyone who dares sit in my chair," he spat. He was hanged, and his body was dipped in tar and displayed at the crossroads. For centuries, the Busby Stoop chair remained in the pub. It became a local dare. But during World War II, the stakes changed. Canadian airmen stationed at a nearby base frequented the pub. The landlord noticed a terrifying correlation. Every single pilot who sat in the chair to prove they weren't afraid never returned from their mission. In 1967, 2 Royal Air Force pilots sat in the chair. On their drive back to the base, their car struck a tree, killing them both. A few years later, a young builder sat in the chair during his lunch break. He fell through a roof that same afternoon and died. A roofer who sat in it fell to his death days later. A cleaning lady who slipped and fell into the chair while mopping died of a brain tumor shortly after. The death rate for sitters wasn't 50%. It wasn't 80%. It was 100%. The landlord became so terrified of the liability that he banished the chair to the cellar. But even there, a delivery man sat on it to rest. He died in a car accident that day. Finally, the chair was donated to the Thirsk Museum, but the museum staff didn't put it in a display case. They didn't put a velvet rope around it, they hung it from the ceiling. It is suspended 5 feet in the air, attached to the wall, ensuring that no human being can ever accidentally sit in it again. We usually rely on control groups and science to test a hypothesis. In this case, the test group kept dying, so the experiment was permanently cancelled. Gravity is the only thing keeping the curse at bay, but while a chair can kill a man, our next location killed an empire. Number 2. The tomb of Timur, Uzbekistan. Timur, known to the West as Tamerlane, was a 14th century conqueror who rivaled Genghis Khan. He was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 17 million people, roughly 5% of the world's population at the time. He built pyramids out of human skulls. He was a man of blood and iron. He was buried in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, under a massive slab of dark green jade. For centuries, local legends warned that the warlord was not sleeping, but waiting. The warning was clear: do not disturb the sleep of the conqueror. But in 1941, Joseph Stalin didn't care about legends. He cared about anthropology and asserting Soviet dominance over history. He sent a team of scientists, led by Mikhail Gerasimov, to exhume the body. The local Muslim clergy begged them to stop. They warned of a curse. The Soviets laughed. They opened the sarcophagus. Inside the tomb, they found an inscription on the casket itself. It read, "Whosoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." The date was June 20, 1941. 2 days later, on June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler broke the Non-Aggression Pact and launched Operation Barbarossa. It was the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military invasion in the history of warfare. The invader more terrible than Timur had arrived. The Soviet Union was almost crushed. Millions died. The timing was precise to the hour. Stalin, who was notoriously paranoid, eventually heard about the curse. As the Battle of Stalingrad raged, the battle that would decide the fate of the war, Stalin ordered the remains of Timur to be returned to Samarkand. He ordered them to be reburied with full Islamic rites, treating the warlord with the respect he demanded. The remains were reinterred and the tomb was sealed on November 20, 1942. Days later, the Soviet army launched Operation Uranus. This was the counterattack that encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, leading to the first major Nazi surrender and the turning point of World War II. Open the tomb, invasion begins. Close the tomb, the enemy falls. Historians call this coincidence, but in the world of probability, this is a sequence that feels engineered. Did a dead warlord dictate the flow of the 20th century's bloodiest war, or does history just have a very dark sense of humor? And yet, there is one curse that is even more scientifically perplexing. Number 1. Ötzi the Iceman, the Alps. In September 1991, 2 German hikers in the Ötztal Alps stumbled across something sticking out of the melting ice. They thought it was the body of a lost mountaineer. They were wrong. They had found Ötzi. Ötzi is a 5,300-year-old Copper Age hunter. He is the oldest natural wet mummy in Europe. He was perfectly preserved, right down to his tattoos, his tools, and the arrow lodged in his shoulder that killed him. It was the archaeological discovery of the century. It opened a window into the past that science had only dreamed of. But it seems Ötzi didn't want to be found. He had died violently, fleeing from enemies, bleeding out in the snow. And 5,000 years later, he began to take the people who disturbed him with him. The curse of Ötzi is a modern forensic mystery. It targets the 7 main people who discovered, recovered, and analyzed him. Let's look at the roster. First, Rainer Henn, the forensic pathologist who picked up Ötzi with his bare hands to place him in a body bag. A year later, he was on his way to give a lecture about the discovery. He died in a horrific, head-on car crash. Second, Kurt Fritz, the mountaineer who led the researchers to the body. He was an expert climber who knew the region better than anyone. He was killed in an avalanche. He was the only member of his expedition party to be hit. Third, Rainer Holtz, the journalist who filmed the removal of the mummy for a documentary. He died of a brain tumor shortly after the film aired. Fourth, Helmut Simon, the German tourist who actually found the body in the ice. Years later, he went missing in the mountains. His body was found after a search. He had fallen to his death, lying face down in the snow in a position eerily similar to Ötzi. Fifth, Dieter Warnecke, the head of the mountain rescue team who searched for Helmut Simon. He died of a heart attack immediately after Simon's funeral. Sixth, Konrad Spindler, the leading archaeologist who examined the mummy. He was vocal about the curse, famously saying, "I think it's a load of rubbish. You're asking for the next victim. I am the next victim." He died shortly after from a rapidly progressing form of multiple sclerosis. Seventh, Tom Loy, a molecular archaeologist who analyzed the blood on Ötzi's weapons. He died of a hereditary blood disease just as he was finishing his book on the Iceman. 7 people, all connected to the physical handling of the body, all dead within a tight window of the discovery. Scientists have looked for ancient bacteria, fungi, or mold spores, like the aspergillus found in Egyptian tombs, that could explain a biological mechanism for these deaths. They found nothing. Ötzi was frozen. He was sterile. This leaves us with the ultimate lingering question. The odds of these 7 specific individuals dying prematurely in violent or sudden ways are astronomical. Is this simply the law of large numbers playing out, Or is it possible that a man who died in violence 5,000 years ago is still projecting that violence into the present? Ötzi now lies in a refrigerated cell in a museum in Bolzano, Italy. You can go look at him through a small window, but given the statistics, maybe you shouldn't staring too long. Number 0, bonus, the Dybbuk Box, Missouri. Because the universe loves a baker's dozen of terror, we have one final file, the Dybbuk Box. This is a modern legend born on eBay in 2001. A wine cabinet was sold with a terrifying backstory. It belonged to a Holocaust survivor who claimed she had trapped a malicious spirit, a Dybbuk, inside it. The buyer, a furniture refinisher, thought it was a cool antique until he brought it into his shop. He reported that the lights would burn out whenever he worked on it. Horrible smells of cat urine and jasmine would manifest from nowhere. And then his mother came to visit. She sat near the box. Within minutes, she suffered a stroke. Her only words to him at the hospital were, "I hate your gift." The box was sold again to Jason Haxton, a director of a medical museum, a man of science. Haxton began to suffer from bizarre health issues, welts appearing on his skin, coughing up blood, and experiencing a metallic taste in his mouth. He reported seeing shadow people in his periphery. Haxton didn't call a ghost hunter, he called a team of rabbis. He eventually took the box and buried it in a secret location, sealed within an ark of acacia wood lined with gold, mimicking the Ark of the Covenant, to contain the energy. Science refuses to touch this because it relies on testimony, not carbon dating. But when a medical museum director, someone trained to value evidence, has to bury an antique to stop coughing up blood, the line between folklore and pathology gets very, very blurry. We have looked at 10 objects and a bonus box that defy explanation. We have seen patterns in the data that suggest the universe is stranger and perhaps more vindictive than we are comfortable admitting. Maybe these are just coincidences. Maybe the human brain is just a pattern recognition machine that malfunctions when it sees tragedy. Or maybe, just maybe, history leaves a fingerprint. And sometimes if you touch that fingerprint, it touches you back. If you want to stay on the safe side of the glass, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We investigate the odd, the unexplained, and the impossible. And seriously, if you find a ring in a field, leave it there, and I'll see you in the next file.